At 75, I never imagined I'd be standing in my son's gleaming office, watching him lean back in his leather chair with that condescending smile I'd grown to despise, telling me it was time I stopped being a burden and found myself a job. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Marcus didn't know, as he gestured dismissively toward the door of Harrison and Associates Construction, was that the signature on his business loan, the one that built this entire empire, belonged to me. I wasn't just Dorothy Harrison, the aging mother he barely tolerated. I was the silent partner who owned 45% of everything he thought was his. The autumn rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 20th floor as I sat across from my son, my hands folded carefully in my lap, listening to him explain why my monthly visits to his office needed to stop. Cedar Falls stretched. Out below us, the city I'd watched grow from a lumber town into this thriving hub of commerce and culture. Somewhere down there was the modest duplex on Maple Street where I'd raised Marcus after his father died, working double shifts at the sawmill to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. The irony wasn't lost on me that 30 years later, I was sitting in an office built with money I'd provided, being lectured about productivity and purpose by the child I'd sacrificed everything to raise. Marcus adjusted his silk tie, a nervous habit I recognized from his childhood, though now it seemed more like an affectation of power than anxiety. His corner office screamed success with its mahogany desk, Persian rugs, and walls lined with awards from the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce. Photos of construction projects dominated one wall, each one representing millions in revenue for Harrison and Associates. What those photos didn't show was the original investment that made it all possible. The nest egg I'd quietly built through decades of careful saving and modest real estate investments. "Mom, you have to understand," Marcus began, his tone taking on that patient quality, reserved for explaining simple concepts to slow children. "Bethany and I have worked hard to build our reputation in this community. We attend the Pine Ridge Country Club, we host charity galas, we move in circles where image matters. Having you drop by the office unannounced looking like..." He gestured vaguely at my simple cardigan and comfortable walking shoes. "Well, it sends the wrong message about our family's success." I'd heard variations of this speech before, usually delivered by Bethany with Marcus nodding along like a dutiful puppet. My daughter-in-law had made no secret of her embarrassment about my modest lifestyle, my preference for practical clothing over designer labels, my tendency to speak directly rather than navigate the elaborate social protocols of Cedar Falls elite circles. "I see," I said quietly, though I was beginning to see much more than Marcus intended. "And what message would that be exactly?" He shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing the edge in my voice that had kept unruly customers in line during my years managing the sawmill's front office. "It's not personal, Mom. It's just that successful businesses require a certain presentation. Our clients expect to see prosperity, sophistication. They need to trust that we're operating at their level." The cruel absurdity of his words settled over me like a weight. This was the child I'd carried on my hip while balancing ledgers late into the night. The boy I'd coached through homework at the kitchen table while calculating payroll for 40 employees. I'd taught him the value of hard work, the importance of treating people with dignity regardless of their circumstances, the meaning of family loyalty. Somehow those lessons had been forgotten in favor of country club memberships and charity galas, designed more for networking than genuine compassion. "Your level," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of those words. "And what level is that, Marcus?" He leaned forward, warming to his theme now, apparently mistaking my quiet tone for acceptance rather than the gathering storm it actually represented. "We're prominent business owners, Mom, leaders in the community. Bethany serves on the hospital board. I'm being considered for city council." We can't have people wondering why my mother looks like she shops at thrift stores and lives in a duplex that hasn't been updated since 1985. The duplex comment stung particularly sharply. That little house on Maple Street represented everything I'd worked for after his father's death. Every sacrifice I'd made to provide stability and security for my grieving son. I'd chosen that neighborhood specifically for its good schools and safe streets, had lovingly maintained every inch of that property even as my arthritis made simple tasks increasingly difficult. I could help you find something more suitable, Marcus continued, apparently interpreting my silence as consideration. There's a new senior living community called Golden Years Residence. Very upscale, lots of activities, people your own age. You'd be much happier there. And it would solve this awkward situation for all of us. I studied his face, searching for any trace of the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, who'd cried in my arms when his father died, who'd sworn he'd take care of me when he grew up and became successful. That child seemed to have been completely replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit, who spoke of our relationship as an awkward situation to be solved. And how exactly would I afford this upscale senior living, Marcus? My Social Security barely covers my current expenses. He waved a hand dismissively, as if money were merely a minor detail to be sorted out later. We'll figure something out. Maybe you could get a part-time job, something appropriate for your age. The grocery store is always looking for greeters, or perhaps you could do some light housekeeping. Nothing too strenuous, but enough to give you purpose and help with the expenses. The suggestion that I needed employment to find purpose in my life was almost as insulting as his assumption that I was financially dependent on his charity. I bit back the immediate response that rose to my lips, the urge to reveal exactly who had been supporting whom all these years. Instead, I asked, "And what about our family dinners? Our Sunday visits?" His expression flickered with something that might have been guilt before the practiced politician's mask returned. "We'll still see each other, of course. Holidays, special occasions. But Bethany feels it would be healthier for everyone if we established some boundaries. Give you space to build your own social circle, pursue your own interests." Bethany feels. There it was. The truth behind this entire conversation. My son had become a mouthpiece for his wife's social anxieties, willing to discard 30 years of close relationship to avoid embarrassing her at the country club. I wondered if he even remembered that I'd been the one to loan him the money. For their wedding, the down payment on their first house, the initial investment that launched Harrison and Associates construction. The intercom on his desk buzzed, and his secretary's voice filled the room. "Mr. Harrison, your wife is here for your lunch appointment." "Send her in," Marcus replied, straightening his tie again. I recognized this as my cue to leave, though he was too polite or perhaps too cowardly to say so directly. Bethany Harrison swept into the office like she owned it, which in her mind she probably did. Perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, jewelry that caught the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. She'd grown up with money, had married Marcus when his business was already successful, and had never known a day of financial uncertainty in her privileged life. "Dorothy," she said with the kind of bright smile reserved for people you wished would disappear. "How lovely to see you. I hope you and Marcus had a nice chat." I stood slowly, gathering my worn leather purse and the dignity I'd somehow managed to maintain throughout this humiliating conversation. "Very enlightening," I replied, noting how Bethany's smile tightened slightly at my tone. "Wonderful. Marcus tells me you're considering some exciting life changes. I think Golden Years Residence sounds absolutely perfect for you. They have bridge, tournaments, and craft classes. You'd love it there." The condescension dripped from every word, the assumption that I was some lonely old woman desperate for activities to fill my empty days. I'd spent the last decade volunteering at the Literacy Center, maintaining extensive gardens that supplied vegetables to the local food bank, and managing investment properties that generated more monthly income than Marcus probably realized. But to Bethany, I was simply an inconvenient reminder of her husband's humble origins, a problem to be quietly relocated out of sight. I'm sure I would, I said evenly. Please don't let me keep you from your lunch. As I walked toward the door, I heard Bethany whisper to Marcus, "Did you tell her about the job thing? I really think it would be good for her to have some structure, some purpose." I paused at the doorway, my hand on the polished brass handle, and turned back to face them both. They stood together behind Marcus's massive desk, the perfect power, couple in their perfect office, discussing my future as if I were a piece of furniture they needed to relocate. "Marcus," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "do you remember what you said at your father's funeral? When you were 16 and scared about how we'd manage without him?" Something flickered in his eyes, a brief glimpse of the boy I'd raised. "Mom, that was a long time ago. You promised you'd take care of me the way I'd taken care of you. You said family was the only thing that really mattered, that success meant nothing if you couldn't share it with the people you loved." I let those words hang in the air for a moment, watching his face. I'm curious when exactly that philosophy changed. Bethany stepped closer to her husband, her manicured hand resting possessively on his arm. "Dorothy, I think you're being a bit dramatic. We're not abandoning you. We're trying to help you find independence and fulfillment." "Independence," I repeated, tasting the irony of that word coming from someone who'd never worked a day in her life, who'd gone from her father's wealth to her husband's success without ever experiencing the kind of independence that came from building something with your own hands and determination. "That's all any parent wants for their children," I continued, my gaze moving between Marcus and his wife. "To know they can stand on their own, make their own way in the world, succeed through their own efforts and abilities." Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable, though whether from guilt or mere embarrassment in front of his wife, I couldn't tell. "Mom, I know this is difficult, but change is part of life. You have to trust that we know what's best." "What's best?" As if they were qualified to make that determination, as if they understood anything about my life, my needs, my capabilities, or my resources. I smiled then, though it felt more like baring teeth than expressing pleasure. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. Change is indeed part of life, and people do need to learn to stand on their own merits." I straightened my shoulders, feeling something shift inside me, a door closing on the woman who'd spent 30 years making excuses for her ungrateful son and opening on someone I'd almost forgotten I could be. "I think I'll take your advice about finding some structure and purpose in my life." I left them standing there, probably already planning how to spin my departure to their country club friends, how to frame this transition as Marcus's generous concern for his aging mother rather than the callous abandonment it actually represented. As I waited for the elevator, I could hear the murmur of their voices through the thick office door. No doubt relieved that the awkward conversation was over and they could return to their perfect life without the inconvenience of family obligation. The elevator descended slowly, giving me time to process what had just occurred. 30 years of careful relationship management, of swallowing pride and accepting crumbs of affection, had just come to an abrupt end. My son had chosen his wife's social comfort over his mother's dignity, had reduced our relationship to a public relations problem requiring management. But Marcus had made one crucial miscalculation in his eagerness to distance himself from his humble origins. He'd forgotten that his success hadn't appeared from nothing, that Harrison and Associates construction had been built on a foundation provided by someone he now considered an embarrassment. The silent partnership agreement locked away in my safety deposit box told a very different story about who owed what to whom in the Harrison family hierarchy. As I walked through the marble lobby of the Riverside Commercial Plaza, past the directory that listed Harrison and Associates in prominent gold lettering, I made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus wanted me to find purpose and structure in my life, if he believed I needed to learn the value of independence and self-reliance, then I would accommodate those wishes in ways he never could have anticipated. The rain had stopped by the time I reached the parking garage, though the autumn air still carried the damp chill that seeped into old bones and reminded you that winter was coming. I sat in my modest sedan for several minutes, watching expensive cars maneuver around me, their drivers probably heading to lunch meetings and business appointments that would determine the direction of millions of dollars in commerce. Most of them had no idea that the elderly woman in the 20-year-old Honda held more real power than all their flashy vehicles and important meetings combined. But they were about to learn, along with my son, that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Vincent Torres had been my attorney for 15 years, had helped me structure the silent partnership that gave Marcus his start, and had advised me through various property investments that had quietly built my wealth far beyond what anyone suspected. It was time for a consultation about exactly what rights and options that partnership agreement provided. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered. "Dorothy, what a pleasant surprise. How are you holding up in this weather?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm well, Vincent, though I find myself in need of some legal advice. Would you have time this afternoon to review the Harrison and Associates partnership documents?" There was a pause, probably as he mentally shifted gears from pleasantries to business. Vincent was too experienced to ask questions over the phone, but I could hear the interest in his voice when he replied. "Of course. Can you be here at 3 o'clock? "I'll be there," I confirmed, already feeling the first stirrings of energy I'd experienced in months. "And Vincent?" "I think it's time we discussed what options are available to a silent partner who's no longer interested in remaining silent." After I ended the call, I sat in the parking garage for a few more minutes, letting the magnitude of my decision settle around me. For 30 years, I'd been content to stay in the background, to let Marcus take credit for building something that wouldn't have existed without my financial foundation. I'd told myself it was what good parents did, supporting their children's success even if it meant sacrificing recognition for your own contributions. But being a good parent didn't require accepting disrespect or allowing your child to treat you as a burden to be managed. Marcus wanted independence? He was about to discover what that really meant, stripped of the safety net he'd never acknowledged but had always relied upon. The drive to Vincent's office gave me time to think about the documents locked in my safety deposit box, the careful legal structure we'd created to protect Marcus from the risks of business ownership while ensuring my investment was secure. At the time, it had seemed like the perfect solution, allowing him to appear as the sole proprietor while giving me the protection of a substantial ownership stake. Now, that same structure was about to become the foundation for a very different kind of family lesson. One that would teach my son about respect, gratitude, and the true meaning of standing on your own merits. If Marcus wanted to treat me like a stranger, then perhaps it was time he learned what it felt like to actually be one. Vincent Torres operated his practice from a converted Victorian mansion in Cedar Falls Historic District, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and established reputation. His office occupied the former library, all dark wood paneling and leather-bound legal volumes, the sort of environment that made important conversations feel properly weighty and significant. He greeted me at the door himself, as he always did, extending both hands in the warm gesture of someone who'd known me long enough to consider me family rather than merely a client. "Dorothy, you look wonderfully determined. I haven't seen that particular expression since you decided to buy the Morrison property against everyone's advice." That investment had tripled in value over 5 years, though Marcus had no idea his mother owned one of Cedar Falls' most profitable commercial buildings. Like so many aspects of my financial life, I'd kept it quiet, avoiding the complications that came with adult children who suddenly viewed their parents differently when they discovered hidden wealth. "I suppose I am determined," I admitted, settling into the familiar leather chair across from his desk. though I'm not entirely sure what I'm determined to do yet. Vincent opened a thick file folder, one I recognized as containing all the documents related to my business relationship with Marcus. Partnership agreements, loan documents, property deeds, and investment records spanning 3 decades of careful financial planning and strategic assistance. "Tell me what's changed," he said simply, his pen poised over a legal pad. I described the morning's conversation, Marcus's dismissive attitude, Bethany's condescending suggestions, and the clear message that my presence in their lives had become an embarrassment to be managed rather than a relationship to be cherished. Vincent listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression growing more serious as I detailed the extent of their disrespect. "So, Marcus believes he built Harrison and Associates entirely through his own efforts and abilities," Vincent summarized when I finished. "And he's now suggesting you find employment to give your life purpose and help cover the costs of relocating you to senior housing." "That's an accurate summary," I confirmed, along with the clear implication that continued contact should be limited to holidays and special occasions, presumably when I can be properly managed and presented. Vincent leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers in the gesture I'd learned meant he was considering various legal strategies. "Dorothy, I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What outcome are you hoping to achieve here?" It was a fair question, one I'd been wrestling with since leaving Marcus's office. What did I want? An apology? A return to our previous relationship? Public acknowledgement of my contributions? Financial recognition? Or something else entirely? "I want him to understand the value of respect," I said finally. "I want him to learn what independence actually costs when you don't have family support to fall back on. And I want to know that I raised a man who's capable of recognizing his mistakes and making amends." Vincent nodded slowly. "Those are reasonable goals, though they'll require careful planning to achieve without destroying your relationship permanently. The partnership agreement gives you significant leverage, but how you use that leverage will determine whether this becomes a teaching moment or a family war." He pulled out the original partnership documents, spreading them across his desk, like a general reviewing battle plans. "Let's review your options, starting with the most conservative approaches and working toward the more dramatic possibilities." As we discussed the legal framework that governed Marcus's business empire, I began to understand just how much power I'd quietly accumulated over the years. The original investment had been structured as a partnership rather than a simple loan, giving me ownership rights that extended far beyond mere financial return. Subsequent injections of capital, property transfers, and business expansions had only strengthened my position until I held what amounted to veto power over major business decisions. "The beauty of this structure," Vincent explained, "is that Marcus has been operating under the assumption that he has sole authority over Harrison and Associates. He's never needed to consult with his silent partner because you've never asserted your rights. But legally, any major change in business operations, any significant financial commitment, any restructuring of the company requires your approval." The implications were staggering. Marcus couldn't sell the business, couldn't take on major debt, couldn't even relocate the offices without my consent. He'd built his empire on a foundation he didn't own and couldn't control, though he'd apparently forgotten that crucial detail in his rush to embrace respectability and social status. What would happen if I simply reminded him of our partnership? "Agreement?" I asked. "That depends on his response," Vincent replied. "If he's willing to acknowledge your position and treat you with appropriate respect, then you could return to the previous arrangement with new boundaries established. But if he chooses to challenge your authority or continue the dismissive behavior..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. If Marcus wanted to test his independence, he was about to discover that his business empire could disappear as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him to rebuild from nothing without the benefit of family support he'd just rejected. "There's another consideration," Vincent added carefully. "Bethany almost certainly doesn't know about the partnership agreement. Her attitude toward you is based on the assumption that you're financially dependent on Marcus's charity. Learning. The truth might be quite educational for her. The thought of Bethany's reaction when she discovered that the woman she'd been condescending to actually held the power to destroy their carefully constructed life was admittedly satisfying. But I wasn't interested in petty revenge, no matter how tempting it might be. I don't want to destroy what Marcus has built, I said firmly. But I do want him to understand that success requires recognizing the contributions of others and that family loyalty is earned through respect, not demanded through guilt. Vincent smiled, the expression of someone who'd spent decades helping families navigate complex relationships and financial disputes. Then I suggest we start with a simple reminder of the partnership terms, delivered in a way that gives Marcus the opportunity to reconsider his recent behavior. If he responds appropriately, we can rebuild your relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than assumed dependence. And if he doesn't respond appropriately, then we move to increasingly firm reminders of where the real power lies in Harrison and Associates construction. Sometimes people need to lose something before they can appreciate its true value. As I left Vincent's office that afternoon, I carried with me a new understanding of my own position and options. For 30 years, I'd chosen to remain in the raw background, supporting my son's ambitions while asking for nothing in return except basic respect and acknowledgement. That respect had now been withdrawn, replaced by embarrassment and dismissal. Marcus wanted me to find structure and purpose in my life? He was about to discover that I'd had both all along, carefully hidden beneath the facade of dependent motherhood he'd found so convenient to believe. The silent partner was about to find her voice, and the lesson in independence was about to begin in earnest. The morning after my consultation with Vincent Torres, I woke with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The autumn sun streamed through the lace curtains of my duplex on Maple Street, illuminating the modest furniture and simple decorations that Bethany found so embarrassing. Looking around my home with fresh eyes, I realized I'd been seeing it through their lens for too long, focusing on what it lacked rather than appreciating what it represented. This house was mine, bought and paid for through my own labor. Every mortgage payment had come from my earnings at the sawmill, every improvement funded by my careful savings. The garden that supplied the food bank with fresh vegetables grew in soil I'd tended for decades. The rooms where I'd raised Marcus and helped him with homework, where I'd comforted him through his father's death and celebrated his early successes, held memories that no amount of marble and mahogany could replace. I made coffee in the kitchen where Marcus had once done homework at the scarred wooden table, where we'd planned his future over countless conversations about college applications and business dreams. Now that same kitchen would become the planning center for a very different kind of education, one that would teach my son about the foundations his success had been built upon. Vincent had given me several options to consider, ranging from gentle reminders to nuclear alternatives. The partnership agreement locked in my safety deposit box provided leverage I'd never needed to use, but Marcus's behavior had changed that equation fundamentally. If he wanted to treat me as irrelevant to his success, then perhaps he needed to experience what that success would look like without my involvement. I opened the kitchen drawer where I kept important papers and pulled out my address book, running my finger down the pages until I found the number I needed. Gerald Walsh had been my accountant for 20 years, helping me manage the rental properties and investments that generated my real income. He'd also prepared the tax returns that showed exactly how much Marcus's business owed to my initial and ongoing financial support. Gerald answered on the second ring, his familiar voice warm with recognition. "Dorothy, always a pleasure. What can I do for you this fine morning?" "Good morning, Jerry. I need to schedule a meeting to review all my business holdings, particularly the Harrison and Associates partnership arrangement. I'm considering some changes to my involvement level." There was a pause as Gerald processed this unusual request. In all our years of working together, I'd been remarkably consistent in my hands-off approach to the construction business, content, to receive my partnership distributions while letting Marcus manage operations. Changes in what direction? He asked carefully. Are you thinking about increasing your involvement or perhaps considering an exit strategy? I'm not sure yet, I admitted. That's why I need to review all the documentation first. What I can tell you is that my relationship with Marcus has become strained, and I need to understand exactly what my options are going forward. Gerald had been managing family business disputes long enough to read between the lines. I see. Would you like me to prepare a comprehensive report showing your total investment in the company, your current ownership percentage, and your legal rights under the partnership agreement? That would be perfect. How soon could you have something ready? Give me 3 days. I'll need to pull records going back to the original formation documents, calculate compounded returns on your capital contributions, and review the current market valuation of the business. After hanging up with Gerald, I made my second call. Of the day, this one to Caroline Foster at Cedar Falls Community Bank. Caroline had been my loan officer when I'd purchased my first rental property 15 years ago, and she'd watched my portfolio grow steadily over the years. More importantly, she handled commercial lending for many of Cedar Falls' prominent businesses, including Harrison and Associates Construction. Mrs. Harrison, what a lovely surprise, Caroline greeted me. How can I help you today? I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss my business interests, particularly in relation to the construction industry here in Cedar Falls. I'm considering some changes to my investment strategy. Caroline's tone shifted slightly, becoming more formal, as she recognized this was a business rather than social call. Of course. Would you prefer to meet at the bank, or would you like me to come to your home? The bank would be fine. I think it's time I started conducting more of my business in professional settings. We arranged to meet the following afternoon, giving me time to gather the documents I'd need. After ending the call, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and began making notes about the points I wanted to cover. For too long, I'd conducted my financial affairs quietly, avoiding attention that might complicate my family relationships. That discretion had served its purpose, but it had also allowed Marcus to forget the reality of his situation. The sound of a car door slamming in my driveway interrupted my planning. Through the kitchen window, I watched Marcus stride up the front walk with the determined expression I recognized from his childhood. The look he wore when he'd decided to confront a problem head-on. Apparently, word of my visit to Vincent Torres had reached him faster than I'd expected. I opened the front door before he could knock, noting how his expensive suit looked oddly out of place against the backdrop of my modest porch with its simple wooden furniture and pots of late-season flowers. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without preamble, his tone carrying the authoritative edge he used in business meetings. "Come in," I replied calmly, leading him to the living room where we'd had so many important conversations over the years. "Can I get you some coffee?" "This isn't a social visit," Marcus said, remaining standing while I settled into my favorite armchair. "I heard from my accountant that you've been asking questions about the business partnership. What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" His accountant. Of course, Marcus would have his own financial advisors monitoring any unusual activity related to Harrison and Associates. I'd expected this conversation, though I hadn't anticipated it happening quite so quickly. "I'm trying to understand my options," I said simply. "Yesterday, you made it very clear that you consider my presence in your professional life to be inappropriate. I thought it might be wise to review exactly what my presence entails." Marcus began pacing the small living room, a habit from his teenage years that emerged whenever he felt cornered or anxious. "Mom, that partnership thing was just a formality, a way to structure the original loan. You know that. It doesn't mean you have any real involvement in running the business." "Doesn't it?" I asked mildly. Perhaps you could explain the difference between a formality and a legal document with binding obligations and rights. He stopped pacing and stared at me, apparently recognizing something in my tone that he hadn't heard before. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying that if you want me to step back from your professional life, then perhaps we should clarify exactly what that means for our business relationship as well. It seems inconsistent to maintain financial partnerships with someone you find embarrassing to acknowledge publicly. The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications of my words began to register. You can't be serious. That partnership was set up to help me get started. You said yourself it was an investment in my future. And it was, I agreed. A very generous investment that has provided you with the foundation for everything you've built since. But investments come with expectations, Marcus. One of those expectations was that you would remember where your opportunities came from and treat your business partner with appropriate respect. Marcus sank into the chair across from me, his confident demeanor cracking for the first time since he'd arrived. Mom, if this is about yesterday, about what I said in the office, I was just trying to help you understand the social pressures we face. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. This isn't about hurt feelings, I replied. It's about respect and recognition. For 30 years, I've been content to remain in the background while you took credit for building something that wouldn't exist without my financial support. I've watched you forget the contributions that made your success possible, and I've said nothing because I thought that's what good parents do. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. But good parenting doesn't require accepting disrespect or allowing your children to treat you as a burden. Yesterday, you made it clear that my presence in your life has become an embarrassment you need to manage. Fine, but you can't have it both ways, Marcus. You can't dismiss me as irrelevant while continuing to benefit from my business partnership. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, destroying the perfect styling he'd paid a fortune to maintain. What exactly are you asking for? Money? Recognition? What do you want? I want you to understand what respect means, I said quietly. I want you to appreciate the sacrifices and contributions that made your success possible, and I want to know that I raised a man who's capable of acknowledging his mistakes and treating his family with dignity. And if I can't give you that? The question came out as barely a whisper. Then perhaps it's time for you to learn what true independence looks like, without the safety net you've never acknowledged but have always relied upon. Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, processing the reality of his situation. Harrison and Associates Construction had been built on a foundation I'd provided, funded by capital I'd contributed, and sustained by ongoing financial support I'd quietly maintained. Without that foundation, his empire would collapse, leaving him to rebuild from nothing at an age when most people were established in their careers. I need to think about this, he said finally, his voice lacking the authority he'd displayed when he arrived. Of course you do, I agreed. Take all the time you need. But Marcus, while you're thinking, remember that business partnerships require trust and mutual respect to function effectively. Yesterday you made it clear that respect is no longer part of our family relationship. I'm simply wondering whether it can survive in our business relationship either. After Marcus left, I sat in my quiet living room feeling a mixture of sadness and determination. This wasn't the conversation I'd wanted to have with my son, but it was the one his behavior had made necessary. For 30 years, I'd enabled his assumption that success was something he'd achieved entirely through his own efforts, while quietly providing the financial foundation that made that success possible. Now, he would have to choose between his pride and the reality of his situation. He could acknowledge the contributions that had built his empire and begin treating me with the respect I deserved, or he could maintain his dismissive attitude and discover what true independence actually cost. The following afternoon, I drove to Cedar Falls Community Bank for my meeting with Caroline Foster. The bank occupied a prominent corner building in the downtown business district, all glass and steel designed to project stability and prosperity. I'd been inside countless times over the years for routine transactions, but this visit felt different, more significant. Caroline met me in the lobby, personally, a professional courtesy that reflected both the size of my accounts and the potential implications of my call. She led me to a private conference room where she'd assembled a folder of documents related to my various business interests. "I've pulled together information on all your holdings, Mrs. Harrison," she began, spreading papers across the polished table. "Your rental properties, investment accounts, and, of course, the Harrison and Associates partnership arrangement. I have to say, your portfolio has performed exceptionally well over the years." I studied the documents, seeing my financial life laid out in neat columns and professional summaries. The numbers were impressive even to me. Decades of careful investing and conservative growth had created wealth I'd never needed to access because my modest lifestyle kept my expenses low. "Caroline, I need to ask you about the Harrison and Associates business loans. What would happen if the partnership structure were to change?" Caroline's expression became more guarded, the careful neutrality of someone who understood she was treading in sensitive family territory. "That would depend on the specific changes being considered. The current loans are secured by both business assets and personal guarantees from Marcus Harrison, but the partnership agreement creates certain complications." "What kind of complications?" "Well, any major restructuring of the partnership would technically trigger a review of the loan terms. If one partner were to withdraw from the arrangement, the remaining partner would need to demonstrate sufficient assets and income to carry the debt independently." The implications were staggering. Marcus had expanded Harrison and Associates aggressively over the years, taking on substantial debt to fund growth and acquisitions. Those loans had been approved based on the financial strength of the partnership, not Marcus's individual resources. Without my backing, he might not qualify for the existing debt levels, let alone new financing for ongoing operations. "And if the remaining partner couldn't qualify for the existing debt?" I asked. "The loans would be called in," Caroline replied carefully. "The business would need to pay down the debt to levels sustainable by the remaining partner, or find alternative financing sources." Caroline began showing me additional documents, charts showing the growth of my investments over time, the steady appreciation of my rental properties, the compound returns on my conservative stock portfolio. It was an impressive presentation, though she seemed nervous about something she wasn't quite ready to address directly. "Mrs. Harrison, may I ask why you're considering changes to the partnership arrangement? From a financial perspective, the current structure has been quite beneficial for all parties involved." I appreciated her diplomatic phrasing, though we both knew the truth was more complex. The partnership had been beneficial for Marcus, providing him with access to capital and credibility he couldn't have obtained on his own. For me, it had been an expensive gesture of parental support disguised as a business investment. "My relationship with my son has become strained," I said simply. "He's indicated that my involvement in his professional life is inappropriate and embarrassing. I'm trying to understand what separating our business and personal relationships would entail." Caroline nodded carefully, the expression of someone who'd seen family businesses torn apart by personal conflicts. "I see. Have you considered mediation? Sometimes these situations can be resolved through professional counseling rather than business restructuring." "I appreciate the suggestion, but I don't think mediation would be appropriate here. This isn't about misunderstanding or communication problems. It's about respect and recognition, values that can't be negotiated through compromise." I gathered the documents Caroline had prepared, noting how my financial strength compared to what Marcus probably realized. "I'd like you to prepare a complete analysis of what would happen if I chose to exercise my rights under the partnership agreement. Not because I've made that decision, but because I need to understand all my options." Caroline agreed to prepare the analysis, though I could see the concern in her expression. Dissolving successful business partnerships was rarely clean or simple, especially when family relationships were involved. But sometimes drastic action was the only way to get someone's attention when gentler approaches had failed. As I drove home from the bank, I passed the Riverside Commercial Plaza where Marcus maintained his offices. The building looked different to me now, not as the symbol of my son's success that I'd always seen, but as a monument to financial arrangements he'd apparently forgotten. Every impressive detail, from the marble lobby to the mahogany-paneled conference rooms, had been made possible by capital I'd provided and guarantees I'd signed. That evening, I received a phone call from Bethany, her voice carrying the strained cheerfulness that meant she was trying to manage a crisis she didn't fully understand. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me calling directly, but Marcus has been so worried about your conversation yesterday. He's concerned that there might be some misunderstanding about the business arrangements." Misunderstanding. As if the legal documents creating our partnership were somehow ambiguous rather than precisely detailed. "There's no misunderstanding, Bethany. I'm simply reviewing my business relationships in light of recent developments." "But Dorothy, surely you don't want to do anything that might hurt Marcus's career. He's worked so hard to build the company, and he's finally gaining the recognition he deserves in the community." The irony of Bethany lecturing me about not wanting to hurt Marcus's career when she'd been the driving force behind yesterday's humiliating conversation was almost laughable. "I want Marcus to succeed, Bethany. I always have. But I also want him to understand that success built on other people's contributions comes with obligations." "What kind of obligations?" Her voice had lost some of its artificial warmth, becoming more businesslike. "The obligation to acknowledge those contributions and treat the people who made them possible with respect and gratitude rather than embarrassment and dismissal." There was a long pause before Bethany spoke again. "Dorothy, I think you might be overreacting to what was really just a suggestion about finding activities that would give your life more structure. No one is trying to dismiss or embarrass you." "Really? Then perhaps you could explain why Marcus believes I need employment to give my life purpose, or why you think I'd be happier in supervised senior housing rather than the home I've maintained for 30 years. Another pause, longer this time. "We were just trying to help you explore options for a more fulfilling lifestyle. If we expressed ourselves poorly, I apologize." The apology was grudging and incomplete, focused more on managing the current crisis than acknowledging the disrespect that had created it. But it was something, a small recognition that their approach had been problematic. "I appreciate the apology, Bethany, though I think you might want to discuss with Marcus exactly what kind of help his business has received over the years. He seems to have forgotten some important details about how Harrison and Associates was founded and funded." What do you mean?" The question came out sharper than she'd probably intended. "I mean that successful businesses require capital, connections, and credibility. Marcus has been fortunate to have access to all three, though he may not have fully appreciated where they came from." After ending the call with Bethany, I realized I'd reached a turning point in my relationship with Marcus and his wife. The polite fiction that had allowed us to maintain family harmony while they gradually distanced themselves from me was no longer sustainable. They now understood that I had options they hadn't considered, leverage they'd forgotten existed. The question now was whether this knowledge would lead to genuine reflection and behavior change, or whether their pride would prevent them from acknowledging the reality of our situation. Marcus had grown accustomed to thinking of himself as a self-made success, and Bethany had built her social identity around being married to Cedar Falls' most prominent young businessman. Learning that both of those narratives were incomplete might be more than their egos could handle. But sometimes people needed to lose something before they could appreciate its true value, and sometimes the most loving thing a parent could do was allow their child to experience the natural consequences of their choices. 3 days later, Gerald Walsh called with the comprehensive report I'd requested. The numbers were even more dramatic than I'd expected, showing decades of compounded investment and accumulated obligations that Marcus had apparently never fully calculated. "Dorothy, I have to ask," Gerald said carefully. "Are you seriously considering dissolving the partnership? Because the financial implications for Marcus would be quite severe." "I'm considering all my options, Jerry. What would those implications be specifically?" Gerald walked me through the analysis, explaining how my withdrawal from the partnership would trigger loan reviews, require debt restructuring, and potentially force the sale of business assets to maintain adequate capitalization. The company that Marcus thought he owned free and clear would suddenly reveal itself to be a house of cards, impressive to look at, but fundamentally unstable without the foundation I'd provided. He could potentially maintain a scaled-back version of the business, Gerald continued, but it would mean giving up the aggressive expansion plans, the prestigious office space, probably most of the high-profile contracts that require bonding, and insurance he couldn't qualify for independently. In other words, Marcus would discover what his business looked like when stripped of advantages he'd never earned and support he'd never acknowledged. It would be a harsh lesson, but perhaps a necessary one for someone who'd forgotten the difference between independence and interdependence. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was no longer the quietly supportive mother who'd spent 30 years enabling her son's assumptions about his own capabilities. I'd become something else entirely, something I'd forgotten I could be. A woman, with power, options, and the willingness to use both when respect and gratitude were withheld. Marcus had wanted me to find structure and purpose in my life. He was about to discover that I'd had both all along, carefully hidden beneath the facade of dependent motherhood he'd found so convenient to believe. The silent partner was preparing to find her voice, and the lesson in true independence was about to begin. The Cedar Falls Business Association's annual Autumn Gala was the kind of event where Bethany thrived, gliding through the crowd at the Grand Cascade Hotel in a designer gown that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Marcus stood beside her in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, playing the role of successful entrepreneur, greeting clients and schmoozing potential partners. They made a striking couple, the embodiment of Cedar Falls's new money elite. What they didn't know was that I was watching from across the elegant ballroom, seated at a table near the back with Frank Delacroix, the construction industry veteran, who'd been Marcus's biggest competitor for the past decade. Frank had invited me as his guest after our chance encounter at Gerald's office earlier that week, and I'd accepted his invitation with a sense of mischievous curiosity about how Marcus would react to seeing me in this setting. I'd chosen my outfit carefully for tonight, a sophisticated navy dress that Caroline had helped me select during an impromptu shopping trip to Portland's upscale boutiques. My hair had been professionally styled at the Grand Cascade Salon, and I wore the pearl necklace my late husband had given me for our 20th anniversary. The woman who looked back at me from the hotel room mirror bore little resemblance to the dowdy mother Marcus had dismissed from his office just 2 weeks earlier. Frank leaned over as the evening's program began, his voice barely audible above the conversation at nearby tables. "Your son keeps looking over here with the most peculiar expression. I don't think he expected to see you tonight." "I imagine not," I replied, watching as Marcus whispered something urgent to Bethany, who immediately turned to scan the room until her gaze found mine. The shock on her face was worth the price of admission alone. The evening's speaker was introducing the Chamber of Commerce's annual awards for business excellence, and I listened with interest as Harrison and Associates Construction was nominated in the category of fastest-growing company. Marcus stepped forward to accept recognition for his achievements, his speech full of gratitude for the opportunities Cedar Falls had provided and his commitment to giving back to the community that had supported his success. Not once did he mention the silent partner whose investment had made that success possible, though I hadn't expected anything different. What did surprise me was how hollow his words sounded, now that I understood the full extent of his ingratitude. He spoke eloquently about hard work and determination, about taking risks and building something from nothing, while carefully omitting any reference to the substantial foundation others had provided. Frank applauded politely as Marcus returned to his table, then turned to me with a knowing smile. Quite a speech. Very inspiring for someone who started with such obvious advantages. What do you mean? I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. Dorothy, I've been in construction for 40 years. I know how much capital it takes to launch the kind of operation Marcus started with. The bonding, requirements, the equipment costs, the overhead for that fancy office space. Most of us spent our first decade working out of trailers and rented storage units, building our reputations one small job at a time. Frank took a sip of his wine before continuing. Marcus appeared on the scene fully formed, with the resources to bid on major projects and the financial backing to take risks that would have destroyed smaller competitors. That kind of advantage doesn't come from nowhere. I said nothing, but Frank didn't seem to need encouragement to continue his analysis. The interesting thing is how he's maintained that advantage over the years. His expansion pattern, the timing of his major acquisitions, the way he's always seemed to have access to capital when opportunities arose. It suggests ongoing financial support from sources that prefer to remain invisible. The accuracy of Frank's assessment was startling, though I supposed anyone in the industry with experience and intelligence could read the signs. Marcus's career trajectory had been too smooth, too well-funded, too free of the setbacks that typically marked entrepreneurial struggles. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Frank's expression became more serious. "Because I've heard rumors about changes in your family situation, about possible shifts in business relationships. If those rumors are true, it could create interesting opportunities for those of us who've been competing with Marcus on an uneven playing field." The implications of his statement settled over me slowly. If my partnership with Marcus dissolved, if Harrison and Associates lost access to the financial resources I'd provided, the entire competitive landscape of Cedar Falls construction would shift dramatically. Marcus's biggest advantage would disappear, leaving him vulnerable to experienced competitors like Frank, who'd built their businesses through genuine struggle and gradual growth. "Frank, are you suggesting that you'd benefit from Marcus's potential difficulties?" "I'm suggesting that fair competition produces better outcomes for everyone except those who've been relying on unfair advantages," he replied. "If Marcus is the businessman he claims to be, he should be able to compete on equal terms with the rest of us." Before I could respond, a commotion near the front of the room drew our attention. Marcus was making his way through the crowd toward our table, his face flushed with what appeared to be barely controlled anger. Bethany followed close behind, her social smile looking strained around the edges. "Mother?" Marcus said when he reached us, his voice tight with forced politeness. "What a surprise to see you here. I didn't realize you were interested in business association events." "Frank was kind enough to invite me," I replied calmly. "I thought it might be educational, to learn more about Cedar Falls's business community." Marcus's gaze shifted to Frank, and I could see him calculating the implications of this unexpected alliance. Frank Delacroix wasn't just a competitor. He was one of the most respected figures in the local construction industry, someone whose opinion carried significant weight with potential clients and community leaders. "Delacroix," Marcus acknowledged with minimal courtesy. "I hope you're enjoying the evening." "Very much," Frank replied smoothly. "Your mother and I have been having the most interesting conversation about the construction business. She has quite an impressive understanding of industry dynamics." Bethany stepped forward, her charm offensive, clearly designed to diffuse whatever tension she sensed building. "Mrs. Harrison, you look absolutely lovely tonight. That dress is stunning." "On you." The compliment was genuine, though I could see the confusion in her eyes as she tried to reconcile this elegantly dressed woman with the frumpy mother-in-law she'd been condescending to for years. The transformation was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental shift in how I saw myself and how I was willing to be seen by others. "Thank you, Bethany." Caroline Foster helped me select it during our shopping trip to Portland last week. She has excellent taste. The mention of Caroline's name caused both Marcus and Bethany to stiffen slightly. They understood the significance of my developing relationship with their banker, the implications of my increased visibility in their professional circles. "Well," Marcus said, clearly eager to end this uncomfortable encounter, "we should let you get back to enjoying your evening." "Frank, always a pleasure." As they retreated to their table across the room, I noticed them engaged in urgent whispered conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction. Frank watched their interaction with obvious amusement. "I think you've given them something to think about," he observed. Nothing quite like seeing a competitor's advantage walking around the room in an evening gown, developing relationships with key industry figures. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, with Frank introducing me to various business leaders and community figures I'd never had occasion to meet during my years of quiet background support. Each conversation revealed another aspect of Cedar Falls' business ecosystem that Marcus had been able to navigate successfully, largely because of resources I'd provided. More importantly, each introduction established me as someone worth knowing, in my own right, not simply as Marcus Harrison's mother. These people responded to my questions about their businesses with genuine interest, treating me as an equal participant in the community's economic life, rather than a peripheral family member requiring polite tolerance. As the evening wound down, Frank offered to escort me to my car, a courtesy that didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. Walking through the hotel lobby beside one of Cedar Falls' most prominent businessmen sent a clear message about my status and connections. "Dorothy, I hope you won't mind some unsolicited advice," Frank said as we waited for the valet to retrieve my car. "Whatever changes you're considering in your business relationships, take your time and think carefully about the long-term implications. Family businesses can be complicated to unravel." "I appreciate your concern, Frank, but I've discovered recently that some complications are worth navigating if they lead to more honest relationships." He nodded approvingly. "Just remember that you have friends in the business community who respect what you've accomplished, regardless of how visible those accomplishments have been. If you need advice or support during any transitions, don't hesitate to ask." Decorer. Drive home gave me time to process the evening's revelations. Marcus's discomfort at seeing me in a professional social setting, Bethany's confusion about my transformed appearance, Frank's clear understanding of the true dynamics behind Harrison and Associates' success, all of it confirmed that my emergence from the shadows was having the intended effect. But more than that, I'd discovered something unexpected about myself. The woman who'd navigated conversations with industry leaders, who'd held her own in discussions about market trends and business strategy, who'd commanded respect from people who barely knew her, had been there all along. She'd simply been buried beneath decades of self-diminishment and accommodating behavior. The next morning brought a phone call from Vincent Torres, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard before. "Dorothy, we need to meet immediately. I've received some disturbing information about Marcus's recent activities that could significantly impact your options going forward." An hour later, I sat in Vincent's office while he spread documents across his desk with the systematic precision of someone presenting evidence in a criminal case. The papers detailed a series of financial maneuvers Marcus had undertaken over the past week, clearly designed to insulate himself from potential partnership dissolution. "He's been trying to restructure the business assets," Vincent explained, pointing to various legal filings. "Transferring equipment to subsidiary companies, moving contracts to new corporate entities, essentially attempting to hollow out Harrison and Associates while preserving the profitable components under his sole control." The sophistication of Marcus's strategy was impressive, though ethically questionable. He'd apparently consulted with attorneys who specialized in partnership disputes and had begun implementing defensive measures designed to minimize my leverage in any future negotiations. "Can he do this legally?" I asked, studying the complex web of corporate restructuring he'd initiated. Some of it, yes, though there are provisions in your partnership agreement that restrict major asset transfers without unanimous consent. He's walking a fine line between legitimate business reorganization and breach of fiduciary duty. Vincent pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the letterhead of a prominent Portland law firm. More concerning is this: he's filed a petition challenging your mental competency to make business decisions, citing your recent erratic behavior, and requesting court supervision of your financial affairs. The betrayal was breathtaking in its audacity. Rather than acknowledging the legitimate grievances I'd raised about respect and recognition, Marcus had chosen to attack my competency, attempting to paint me as a confused elderly woman whose decision-making abilities had become impaired. "What kind of evidence is he presenting?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "The usual collection of anecdotal observations about forgetfulness, claims about unusual spending patterns, suggestions that you're being manipulated by outside parties with financial interests in disrupting the family business relationship." Vincent's expression grew grimmer as he continued. "He's also submitted statements from Bethany and several of their friends describing your recent behavior as uncharacteristic and concerning. The implication is that someone with diminished capacity shouldn't be making major decisions about business partnerships." The cruelty of the strategy was remarkable. Marcus was essentially arguing that my refusal to accept his disrespectful treatment was evidence of mental incompetence, that my emergence from passive acceptance into active self-advocacy represented cognitive decline rather than personal growth. "What are our options for responding?" I asked. "Several approaches are available, though they all depend on how aggressively you want to counterattack. We could simply defend against the competency challenge, which I'm confident we'd win given your recent professional activities and clear thinking. Or we could go on the offensive, using his attempted asset manipulation as grounds for immediate partnership dissolution under adverse conditions." Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying my reaction carefully. "There's also a third option, one that might be more satisfying given the nature of his attack on your competency." "What kind of third option?" "We could arrange for you to attend the competency hearing in a way that demonstrates exactly how competent and well-prepared you are. Sometimes the best defense is allowing your opponent to underestimate you until it's too late for them to recover." The idea was intriguing, though I needed to understand the implications fully before committing to such a confrontational approach. What would that involve exactly? "Public demonstration of your business acumen, your understanding of the partnership. Arrangements? Your command of the financial details Marcus seems to think you're incapable of grasping. Essentially, turning his own legal strategy against him in a very visible way." As Vincent outlined the possibilities, I realized that Marcus had made a fundamental miscalculation in his desperation to maintain control. By challenging my competency, in a legal forum, he'd created an opportunity for me to demonstrate publicly just how competent I actually was, while simultaneously exposing the extent of his dependence on resources he'd never acknowledged. The competency hearing would become something very different from what he'd intended. Less an evaluation of my mental fitness, and more a comprehensive examination of our entire business relationship. Every financial contribution I'd made, every guarantee I'd signed, every advantage he'd gained through my support would become part of the public record. "Vincent, if we proceed with this approach, what are the potential outcomes?" "Best case scenario, the competency challenge gets dismissed, so thoroughly that Marcus loses credibility for any future legal maneuvers. Worst case, we end up in protracted litigation that damages your family relationship permanently. And if we take the middle ground, simply defending against his accusations without escalating? Then you maintain the status quo, which means continuing to be treated as a lesser partner in a business arrangement you've funded while Marcus continues his pattern of disrespectful behavior." The choice was becoming clearer. I could retreat to the safety of familiar patterns, accepting Marcus's characterization of me as someone whose opinions didn't matter and whose contributions could be dismissed. Or I could step fully into the light, using his own legal challenge as a platform to demonstrate exactly who had been supporting whom in the Harrison family business empire. Schedule the hearing preparation, I decided. If Marcus wants to question my competency, then he'll have the opportunity to see exactly how competent I am. Vincent smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd been hoping I'd reach that conclusion. Excellent. We'll need character witnesses, financial experts, and comprehensive documentation of your business activities. By the time we're finished, the court will have a very clear picture of who's been making the real decisions in this partnership. As I left Vincent's office that afternoon, I passed the construction site where Harrison and Associates was building Cedar Falls' new civic center, a $10 million project that represented the pinnacle of Marcus's professional achievement. The irony wasn't lost on me that the cranes and equipment bearing his company's name were purchased with capital I'd provided, operated by workers whose salaries were ultimately funded by my investment. Soon, everyone involved in Cedar Falls' business community would understand those connections clearly. Marcus's challenge to my competency would become the vehicle for revealing the true nature of our partnership, the foundation his success had been built upon, and the respect he should have been showing all along. The silent partner was about to become very vocal indeed, and the lesson in genuine independence was about to be delivered in the most public way possible. 3 days later, I received an unexpected visitor at my Maple Street duplex. Caroline Foster stood on my front porch, holding a folder of documents, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal sympathy. "Mrs. Harrison, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced, but I felt this conversation needed to happen face-to-face rather than over the phone." I invited her into my living room, noting how she glanced around with what appeared to be new appreciation for the modest comfort of my home. The woman who'd helped me shop in Portland's finest boutiques was seeing a different side of my life, the practical simplicity that had allowed me to accumulate wealth while others spent theirs on appearances. "Dorothy, I need to inform you that Marcus visited the bank yesterday with his attorney, requesting detailed information about your financial holdings and questioning your capacity to make sound business decisions." The speed with which Marcus was escalating his campaign was remarkable, though not entirely surprising given the stakes involved. If he could successfully challenge my competency, he could potentially void any decisions I'd made about the partnership while painting himself as the responsible family member protecting an elderly relative from financial manipulation. "What kind of information was he seeking?" I asked. Caroline opened her folder, revealing copies of the forms Marcus and his attorney had submitted. "They wanted access to your account records, details about your investment activities, documentation of any recent large expenditures or unusual transactions. They also requested information about any third parties who might have undue influence over your financial decisions." The implications were clear. Marcus was building a case that I'd become financially irresponsible or susceptible to manipulation, using any deviation from my historically conservative patterns as evidence of declining judgment. Of course, we couldn't provide that information without your explicit consent, Caroline continued, but I wanted you to know about the request and to discuss how you'd like to handle any future inquiries of this nature. I studied the documents Marcus had submitted, noting the careful legal language designed to raise questions about my mental state without making specific accusations that could be easily refuted. His attorney had crafted the requests skillfully, implying incompetence while maintaining plausible deniability about malicious intent. "Caroline, in your professional opinion, do my recent financial activities suggest impaired judgment or unusual susceptibility to outside influence?" She shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. Your decisions have been well-informed and strategically sound. The only unusual aspect has been your increased engagement with financial planning, which suggests improved rather than diminished competency. Then I'd like you to prepare a comprehensive report documenting exactly that conclusion, including specific analysis of my decision-making process and financial acumen. If Marcus wants to question my competency, he should have access to professional evaluation of the evidence. Caroline smiled with obvious approval. I'll have our senior financial analyst prepare a detailed assessment. It will make very interesting reading for anyone who assumes that age correlates with incompetence. After Caroline left, I spent the evening reviewing my own records, preparing for the legal battle Marcus had chosen to initiate. Each document told the story of careful planning and conservative growth, of decisions made with full understanding of risks and benefits. The portrait that emerged was of someone who'd managed complex financial arrangements successfully for decades, hardly the confused elderly woman Marcus was trying to present to the court. But more than that, the records revealed the true scope of my contribution to Harrison and Associates construction. Every major expansion, every equipment purchase, every contract that had elevated Marcus's reputation in the industry had been made possible by capital I'd provided or guarantees I'd signed. The business he thought he owned independently was revealed to be a complex web of interdependencies with me at the center. The competency hearing would give me the opportunity to present this evidence publicly, to demonstrate not just my mental fitness, but the extent of Marcus's dependence on support he'd never acknowledged. His attack on my judgment would become the vehicle for exposing his own lack of genuine independence. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 3 weeks. The woman who'd been dismissed from her son's office as an embarrassing burden had been transformed into someone commanding respect from bankers, lawyers, and business leaders. The quiet mother who'd spent 30 years in the background was stepping into the spotlight, ready to claim credit for contributions that had been invisible for too long. Marcus had challenged my competency, apparently assuming I would retreat or capitulate in the face of such an accusation. Instead, he'd given me exactly what I needed: a public forum to demonstrate who I really was and what I'd actually accomplished. The silent partner was about to find her voice in the most dramatic way possible. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters when I arrived for the competency hearing, their cameras flashing as Vincent Torres escorted me through the throng of journalists who had somehow learned about Marcus's legal challenge. Word had spread through Cedar Falls' tight-knit business community that Dorothy Harrison, the silent partner behind the city's most successful construction company, was being forced to defend her mental fitness in court by her own son. I had dressed carefully for this moment, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that projected both authority and dignity. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup subtle but polished. The woman walking up those courthouse steps bore no resemblance to the dismissed mother who had been told to find employment just a month earlier. This was someone prepared to do battle, armed with 30 years of carefully documented evidence and a newfound determination to claim her rightful place in the narrative of Harrison and Associates construction. Vincent had assembled an impressive team for my defense, including Gerald Walsh with his detailed financial analysis, Caroline Foster with her professional assessment of my banking activities, and Dr. Rebecca Chen, a respected neurologist who had conducted comprehensive cognitive testing at my request. The results of those tests would form the foundation of our response to Marcus's accusations, though I suspected the real drama would come from revelations about our business relationship. Inside the courtroom, I spotted Marcus sitting at the plaintiff's table with his high-powered attorney from Portland, a silver-haired man named Richard Blackstone who specialized in elder law and competency challenges. Bethany sat directly behind them in the gallery, flanked by several of their country club friends who had apparently come to provide moral support for what they believed would be a routine legal formality. The surprise was seeing Frank Delacroix seated in the back row, along with several other prominent Cedar Falls business leaders I recognized from the autumn gala. Word of this hearing had clearly spread beyond family circles, drawing observers who understood the potential implications for the local construction industry. Judge Margaret Sullivan entered with the authority of someone who had presided over countless family disputes and business conflicts during her 20 years on the bench. She was known for her no-nonsense approach to legal proceedings and her particular intolerance for frivolous litigation designed to gain tactical advantage rather than serve justice. This court is convened to examine a petition filed by Marcus Harrison questioning the mental competency of Dorothy Harrison to make business and financial decisions. Judge Sullivan announced. Mr. Blackstone, you may present your opening statement. Marcus's attorney rose with practiced confidence, clearly expecting this to be a straightforward case of concerned family members protecting an elderly relative from poor judgment. Your Honor, we are here today because Mrs. Dorothy Harrison, at the age of 75, has begun exhibiting patterns of behavior that suggest diminished capacity to make sound financial and business decisions. Blackstone gestured toward a stack of documents on his table. Over the past month, Mrs. Harrison has threatened to dissolve a successful business partnership that has operated smoothly for 30 years. She has made unusual expenditures on luxury items and services inconsistent with her historically frugal lifestyle. She has begun associating with individuals who may have financial interests in disrupting stable family business arrangements. The characterization was skillfully crafted to make my recent activities sound like the confused actions of someone whose judgment had become impaired. Vincent had warned me that Blackstone was known for his ability to paint normal behavior, in pathological terms, when it served his client's interests. Furthermore, Blackstone continued, Mrs. Harrison has displayed increased aggressiveness and confrontational behavior toward her son, making threats and demands that are entirely out of character for someone who has previously been content with a passive role in family business matters. I listened to this distorted version of recent events with fascination, noting how skillfully Blackstone had reframed my emergence from passive acceptance into active self-advocacy as evidence of mental decline rather than personal growth. In his narrative, standing up for myself became confrontational behavior, asserting my legal rights became making threats, and developing professional relationships became susceptibility to manipulation. Your Honor, we are asking this court to appoint a guardian to oversee Mrs. Harrison's financial affairs and to void any business decisions she has made during this period of apparent cognitive decline. This protection is necessary not only for Mrs. Harrison's own welfare, but to prevent the destruction of a successful business that employs dozens of people and contributes significantly to Cedar Falls' economic vitality. When Blackstone finished, Judge Sullivan turned to Vincent with an expression that suggested she was already skeptical of the case being presented. Mr. Torres, you may respond. Vincent stood with the calm confidence of someone who held significantly stronger cards than his opponent realized. Thank you, Your Honor. What we have here is not a case of diminished mental capacity, but rather a calculated attempt to silence a business partner who has finally decided to assert her legitimate rights after 30 years of generous forbearance. He moved to a display easel that had been set up near the jury box, pulling back a cloth to reveal a comprehensive chart showing the financial structure of Harrison & Associates Construction. The diagram was complex but clear, with colored lines indicating capital flows, ownership percentages, and decision-making authority. Mrs. Dorothy Harrison is not a confused elderly woman making irrational threats about a business she doesn't understand, Vincent continued. She is the majority financial partner in Harrison & Associates Construction, having provided the initial capital, ongoing funding, and personal guarantees that have made every aspect of the company's success possible. A murmur ran through the courtroom as the implications of Vincent's statement became clear. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, apparently realizing that his attorney had not been fully informed about the true nature of our business relationship. Vincent walked to his table and picked up a thick folder. Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence the original partnership agreement between Dorothy Harrison and Marcus Harrison, dated 30 years ago, which clearly establishes Mrs. Harrison's 45% ownership stake in the company and her authority over major business decisions. Judge Sullivan accepted the documents, scanning them quickly before looking up with obvious interest. Mr. Blackstone, were you aware of these partnership arrangements when you filed this competency petition? Blackstone glanced at Marcus with barely concealed irritation. Your Honor, we were informed that Mrs. Harrison had made some initial financial contributions to the business, but we understood these to be gifts or loans rather than ongoing partnership arrangements. I see, Judge Sullivan replied dryly. Mr. Torres, please continue. Vincent returned to his chart, using a laser pointer to highlight specific elements of the business structure. Over the past 30 years, Mrs. Harrison has contributed over $2 million in direct capital investment to Harrison and Associates construction. She has personally guaranteed loans totaling an additional $4 million. She owns the building where the company maintains its offices, having purchased it specifically to provide stable headquarters for the business. Each revelation drew visible reactions from the gallery, where the assembled business leaders were clearly calculating the implications of these financial arrangements. Frank Delacroix was taking notes, probably already considering how this information might affect competitive dynamics in the local construction market. Furthermore, Vincent continued, Mrs. Harrison has been the primary source of bonding capacity that has allowed Harrison and Associates to bid on major municipal and commercial projects. Without her financial backing, the company would not qualify for the insurance and performance bonds required for contracts exceeding $500,000. Marcus was now visibly pale, apparently realizing how thoroughly his attorney had miscalculated the strength of his position. Bethany leaned forward to whisper urgently in his ear, probably demanding explanations he couldn't provide. Vincent moved to another display board, this one showing a timeline of Harrison and Associates' major milestones alongside my financial contributions. Every significant expansion of the business, every major equipment purchase, every prestigious contract that has built Marcus Harrison's reputation in this community has been made possible by capital and guarantees provided by Dorothy Harrison. He paused, allowing the weight of this information to settle over the courtroom. Yet when Mrs. Harrison recently requested basic respect and acknowledgement of her contributions, she was told that her presence in the business environment was inappropriate and embarrassing. She was advised to find employment to give her life purpose, and to consider moving to supervised senior housing to avoid creating social awkwardness for her son and daughter-in-law. Judge Sullivan's expression had grown increasingly stern as Vincent outlined the background of the family conflict. Mr. Torres, are you suggesting that this competency challenge is retaliation for Mrs. Harrison's decision to assert her partnership rights? That is exactly what I'm suggesting, Your Honor. Rather than acknowledging his mother's legitimate grievances about respect and recognition, Mr. Marcus Harrison chose to attack her mental fitness, apparently believing that portraying her as incompetent would allow him to void her partnership rights and maintain sole control over a business he has never actually owned independently. Vincent returned to his table and picked up another folder. Your Honor, I would like to call our first witness, Dr. Rebecca Chen, to testify about Mrs. Harrison's current mental state and cognitive abilities. Dr. Chen was a distinguished neurologist in her 50s who had built her reputation on thorough, objective assessments rather than advocacy for either side in legal disputes. She took the witness stand with the calm authority of someone who had testified in dozens of competency cases. Dr. Chen, Vincent began, did you have occasion to examine Mrs. Dorothy Harrison at my request? Yes. I conducted a comprehensive neurological and cognitive assessment of Mrs. Harrison 2 weeks ago, including standardized tests for memory, reasoning, executive function, and decision-making capacity. What were the results of those tests? Dr. Chen consulted her notes before responding. Mrs. Harrison scored in the 92nd percentile for her age group across all cognitive measures. Her memory function is excellent, her reasoning abilities are sharp, and her capacity for complex decision-making is well above average for adults of any age. In your professional opinion, does Mrs. Harrison show any signs of diminished mental capacity or impaired judgment? None whatsoever. In fact, Mrs. Harrison demonstrates cognitive abilities that would be considered superior in someone 30 years younger. She showed no evidence of confusion, memory impairment, or susceptibility to undue influence. Vincent nodded with satisfaction. Dr. Chen, are you familiar with the specific allegations made in this competency petition? Yes, I reviewed the petition as part of my assessment process. Do any of the behaviors described in that petition suggest mental incompetence to you? Dr. Chen shook her head firmly. The behaviors described appear to be those of someone who has decided to become more assertive about her rights and interests. This is actually a sign of healthy aging rather than cognitive decline. Many elderly individuals become more direct and less willing to accommodate others' demands as they gain perspective on their own mortality and priorities. When Vincent finished his examination, Blackstone approached Dr. Chen with obvious reluctance, apparently realizing that his cross-examination was unlikely to undermine her credibility or conclusions. Dr. Chen, isn't it true that cognitive decline can be episodic, with periods of apparent clarity alternating with periods of confusion or poor judgment? That can occur with certain conditions, but I found no evidence of such patterns in Mrs. Harrison's case. Her cognitive function appears to be consistently high across all domains. But couldn't someone with declining capacity make decisions that seem rational on the surface but are actually motivated by confusion or manipulation by others? Dr. Chen considered the question carefully. That's theoretically possible, but would require evidence of specific manipulation or cognitive impairment. I found neither in Mrs. Harrison's case. Her recent decisions appear to be the result of clear thinking and assertive self-advocacy. Blackstone returned to his seat. Without having made any progress in undermining Dr. Chen's testimony, Judge Sullivan made notes on her legal pad before looking up at Vincent. Mr. Torres, do you have additional witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call Caroline Foster from Cedar Falls Community Bank. Caroline took the witness stand, with the professional composure I'd come to expect from her, though I could see the tension in her shoulders as she faced the packed courtroom. Her testimony would be crucial in demonstrating my financial competence and business acumen. Ms. Foster, how long have you known Dorothy Harrison in a professional capacity? Approximately 15 years. I've been her primary banking relationship manager during that time, handling her personal accounts, investment portfolio, and various business arrangements. Can you describe the nature of Mrs. Harrison's financial activities during that period? Caroline straightened in her chair, clearly prepared for this question. Mrs. Harrison has been one of our most sophisticated and successful clients. She has built a diversified investment portfolio worth approximately $3 million through conservative strategies and careful planning. She owns multiple rental properties that generate substantial monthly income. Her financial management has been exemplary. Vincent moved closer to the witness stand. Ms. Foster, have you observed any changes in Mrs. Harrison's financial decision-making over the past month? Yes, she has become more actively engaged in reviewing her business, interests, and investment strategies. However, this increased engagement demonstrates enhanced rather than diminished financial competence. Can you give the court an example? Caroline glanced at me before responding. Mrs. Harrison recently requested comprehensive analysis of her partnership arrangement with Harrison and Associates Construction, including detailed projections of various scenarios for restructuring the relationship. Her questions were sophisticated, and her understanding of complex financial concepts was impressive. In your professional opinion, does Mrs. Harrison have the mental capacity to make sound business and financial decisions? Absolutely. Her cognitive abilities and financial acumen are superior to most clients I work with, regardless of age. Blackstone's cross-examination of Caroline was brief and ineffective, clearly hampered by his lack of understanding about the true scope of my financial sophistication. When she stepped down, Vincent called Gerald Walsh to provide detailed testimony about my investment history and business management skills. Gerald's presentation was devastating to Marcus's case, demonstrating through charts and financial records that I had been making complex business decisions successfully for decades. He showed how my investment returns had consistently outperformed market averages, how my property acquisitions had generated substantial appreciation, and how my support of Harrison and Associates had been strategically planned rather than emotionally driven. "Mr. Walsh," Vincent asked, "based on your 20 years of working with Mrs. Harrison, would you characterize her recent decisions about the construction business partnership as rational and well-informed?" "Completely rational," Gerald replied. "Mrs. Harrison has every right to expect acknowledgement and respect for her contributions to the business. Her willingness to assert those rights demonstrates sound judgment and appropriate self-advocacy." When Gerald finished his testimony, Vincent stood to address the court directly. "Your Honor, the evidence presented today demonstrates conclusively that Dorothy Harrison possesses full mental capacity to make business and financial decisions. The real issue here is not Mrs. Harrison's competence, but rather her son's reluctance to acknowledge the true source of his business success." Vincent walked back to the financial chart, gesturing toward the complex web of relationships and obligations it illustrated. "Marcus Harrison has built his reputation and social standing on the foundation of his mother's generosity and financial support. When she finally asked for basic respect and recognition in return, he chose to attack her mental fitness rather than acknowledge his debt to her contributions." Judge Sullivan had been taking extensive notes throughout the proceedings, and now she looked up at both legal teams with an expression that suggested she had reached clear conclusions about the merits of the case. "Mr. Blackstone, would your client like to testify on his own behalf?" Blackstone conferred briefly with Marcus before responding. "Your Honor, given the testimony we've heard today, my client would prefer not to testify at this time." It was a wise decision, though probably too late to salvage Marcus's case. Taking the stand would have required him to explain under oath why he had characterized me as mentally incompetent when the evidence clearly demonstrated the opposite. Judge Sullivan consulted her notes one final time before delivering her ruling. "Based on the testimony and evidence presented today, this court finds no basis whatsoever for questioning Dorothy Harrison's mental competency. The petition is dismissed with prejudice." She paused, fixing Marcus with a stern gaze. "Furthermore, this court finds that the competency challenge appears to have been filed in bad faith, as a tactical maneuver in a business dispute rather than from genuine concern about Mrs. Harrison's welfare. Mr. Marcus Harrison, you are hereby ordered to pay all court costs and attorney fees associated with these proceedings." The ruling sent a buzz through the courtroom gallery, where the assembled business leaders were clearly processing the implications of what they had witnessed. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, apparently stunned by the comprehensive nature of his defeat. But Judge Sullivan wasn't finished. "Mrs. Harrison, this court recognizes that you have been subjected to a frivolous legal challenge that appears designed to silence your legitimate business concerns. You are entitled to pursue any remedies available to you under your partnership agreements, free from further harassment or intimidation." As we left the courthouse, the reporters who had gathered for what they expected to be a routine competency hearing instead found themselves covering a dramatic revelation about one of Cedar Falls' most prominent business relationships. The headlines would write themselves: "Silent Partner Speaks," "Construction Empire Built on Mother's Money," "Son Challenges Mother's Sanity," "Loses Everything." Vincent was clearly satisfied with the outcome as we descended the courthouse steps. "Dorothy, that was one of the most complete victories I've seen in 30 years of practice. Marcus didn't just lose his competency challenge. He exposed the true nature of your business relationship in the most public way possible." Frank Delacroix approached us at the bottom of the steps, his expression a mixture of respect and sympathy. "Dorothy, I hope you know that everyone in the business community understands what really happened here today. Your son made a serious mistake in judgment, and I suspect he's going to discover that reputation and relationships are harder to rebuild than he imagined." As I drove home from the courthouse, I reflected on how completely the dynamics of my relationship with Marcus had shifted. The woman who had been dismissed as an embarrassing burden had just demonstrated in open court that she was the financial foundation of everything he had achieved. The son who had questioned his mother's competency had been revealed as someone whose success depended entirely on support he had never acknowledged. The silent partner had found her voice in the most dramatic way possible, and the lesson in genuine independence was about to begin in earnest. The morning after the courthouse victory, I sat in my kitchen on Maple Street reading the Cedar Falls Herald's front-page coverage of the competency hearing. The headline read, "Local Business Empire Built on Mother's Hidden Investment," and the article detailed every revelation that had emerged during the proceedings. Marcus's humiliation was complete and public, his reputation as a self-made entrepreneur permanently shattered by the truth about his financial dependence. My phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, with calls from reporters, business associates, and curious neighbors who had suddenly discovered that the quiet woman in the duplex was actually one of Cedar Falls' most significant investors. I'd let most calls go to voicemail, preferring to process the magnitude of what had occurred before dealing with the outside world's reaction. The most interesting call had come from Mayor Patricia Hendricks, who wanted to discuss my potential interest in serving on the city's Economic Development Committee. Apparently, someone with my financial acumen and investment experience would be a valuable addition to municipal planning efforts. The irony wasn't lost on me that recognition for my business capabilities had come only after I'd been forced to demonstrate them in court. Around 10 o'clock, a knock at my front door interrupted my quiet morning. Through the window, I could see Marcus standing on my porch, his usually perfect appearance disheveled and his confident demeanor replaced by something I hadn't seen since his teenage years: genuine vulnerability. I opened the door but didn't invite him in, waiting to see what he had come to say after his spectacular legal defeat. "Mom, I need to talk to you," he said, his voice lacking the authoritative tone I'd grown accustomed to over the years. "Please." I stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he glanced around the modest living room as if seeing it for the first time. The comfortable furniture and simple decorations that had once embarrassed him now seemed to represent something different, evidence of the practical wisdom that had allowed me to accumulate wealth while others spent theirs on appearances. Marcus sat heavily in the armchair across from me, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I owe you an apology," he began, the words coming slowly as if each one was difficult to speak. "Yesterday, in that courtroom, I heard things about our business relationship that I had somehow forgotten or chosen to ignore." I remained silent, allowing him to continue without interruption. When Vincent laid out all the financial details, when he showed that chart of who had actually provided what over the years, I realized I had been living in a fantasy about my own success. Marcus looked up at me with eyes that held genuine remorse. "I had convinced myself that your initial help was just a loan, that everything I built afterward was entirely my own accomplishment." The admission was significant, though I wondered if it was motivated by genuine recognition or simply by the practical reality that his business empire could collapse without my continued support. "The truth is," Marcus continued, "I never wanted to acknowledge how much I owed you because it made me feel like a fraud. All these years, people have been congratulating me on my business acumen, my entrepreneurial success, my ability to build something from nothing. But it wasn't from nothing, was it? It was from your savings, your guarantees, your willingness to risk everything you had worked for to give me opportunities I never could have created on my own." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculating manipulation that had characterized our interactions over the past month. What I saw instead was exhaustion and something that might have been shame. "Marcus, why are you telling me this now?" I asked quietly. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I remembered from his childhood. "Because I spent all night thinking about what happened in that courtroom, about how I had painted you as mentally incompetent when you've actually been the most competent person in our entire business relationship." because I realized that I had become someone I don't recognize, someone who would attack his own mother's sanity rather than admit his dependence on her generosity. The words hung in the air between us, weighted with 30 years of unacknowledged truth. Bethany and I have been living in a bubble, Marcus continued. We got so caught up in maintaining our image, in being seen as successful and sophisticated, that we lost sight of the values you tried to teach me: respect, gratitude, family loyalty. I forgot that success without integrity is meaningless. I found myself cautiously hopeful that this might represent genuine self-reflection rather than strategic positioning. What exactly are you saying, Marcus? I'm saying that I want to make this right, if it's possible. I want to acknowledge publicly what you've done for me, for the business, for our family. I want to restructure our partnership so that you receive the recognition and respect you deserve, not just privately but in the community where you've been invisible for too long. The offer was more than I had expected, though I needed to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. What would that look like specifically? Marcus pulled out a folder from his briefcase, spreading documents across my coffee table. I've been working with my attorney since 5 this morning, drawing up a new partnership agreement that reflects the reality of our relationship rather than the fiction I've been maintaining. He pointed to the first document. This would restructure Harrison and Associates as Harrison Family Construction, with you listed as founding partner and primary investor. Your name would appear on all company materials, building signage, contract documentation. The second document outlined a revised profit-sharing arrangement that would give me 60% of the company's earnings, reflecting my actual level of investment and risk. The third established a formal role for me in major business decisions, with the authority to approve or reject significant contracts and expansion plans. Most importantly, Marcus said, indicating the final document, this creates a public acknowledgement of your contributions, including a press release that would be distributed to every major business publication in the Pacific Northwest. No more hiding behind the scenes while I take credit for what we've built together. I examined the documents carefully, noting that Vincent Torres had co-signed them as witness, suggesting that Marcus had sought legal advice to ensure these arrangements were comprehensive and binding. Why now? I asked. What's changed since yesterday morning when you were still trying to have me declared incompetent? Marcus was quiet for a long moment before answering. Yesterday morning, I was still trying to protect my ego and my image. Yesterday afternoon, sitting in that courtroom listening to the evidence of your competence and my dependence, I realized that my ego and image were built on lies. I can't continue living a life based on denying the truth about the most important relationship in my business. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mom, I know I've hurt you deeply. I know I've been ungrateful and disrespectful. I know I've allowed Bethany's social anxieties to poison my judgment about what really matters. But I also know that I love you, and I don't want to lose you because of my pride and stupidity. The vulnerability in his voice reminded me of the boy I had raised, the child who had come to me with problems and fears, trusting that I would help him find solutions. That boy had been buried beneath years of business success and social climbing, but perhaps he hadn't disappeared entirely. What about Bethany? I asked. Yesterday she was part of the effort to have me declared incompetent. What's her position on these proposed changes? Marcus's expression darkened slightly. Bethany and I had a very difficult conversation last night. She's been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own attitudes and behavior. She realizes now that her embarrassment about your lifestyle was actually embarrassment about the authenticity and substance that she lacks. He paused, choosing his words carefully. She wants to apologize to you personally and to begin rebuilding a relationship based on respect rather than condescension. But I'll be honest, Mom. If you're not willing to forgive her immediately, I understand. Some damage takes time to repair. The admission that his marriage was experiencing strain because of this conflict was unexpected, though not entirely surprising. Bethany's identity had been built around being married to a successful, self-made entrepreneur. Learning that her husband was actually dependent on his elderly mother's financial support would require significant adjustment to her self-image and social positioning. Marcus, I appreciate this apology and these proposed changes, but I need you to understand something important. This isn't just about business arrangements or public recognition. It's about fundamental respect and acknowledgement of contributions. Those are things that have to be earned consistently over time, not just promised in moments of crisis. I set the documents aside and looked directly at him. For 30 years, I've watched you take credit for achievements that were only possible because of my support. I've listened to you speak at community events about your entrepreneurial journey without ever mentioning the foundation I provided. I've endured condescension from your wife and dismissal from you, all while continuing to provide the financial backing that made your lifestyle possible. Marcus had the grace to look ashamed as I continued. Yesterday's competency challenge wasn't just an attack on my mental fitness. It was the culmination of years of disrespect, the final attempt to silence someone whose existence complicated your preferred narrative about your own success. That kind of fundamental disregard doesn't disappear because of one apology and a restructured business agreement. I could see the weight of my words settling over him, the recognition that repairing our relationship would require more than legal documents and public acknowledgments. "What would you need from me to begin rebuilding trust?" he asked quietly. "Time," I replied. "Consistent behavior over an extended period that demonstrates genuine respect and gratitude rather than strategic positioning. Actions that show you understand the difference between acknowledging my contributions because you have to and acknowledging them because you genuinely appreciate their significance." Marcus nodded slowly. "I understand. What about the business? Partnership? Are you willing to consider these restructuring proposals? Or would you prefer to dissolve our arrangement entirely?" The question went to the heart of what I had been struggling with since this conflict began. Did I want to continue working with someone who had shown such fundamental disrespect, even if he was now promising to change? Or would it be better to end our business relationship and allow him to succeed or fail based on his own capabilities? "I'm willing to consider maintaining our partnership under the revised terms you've proposed," I said finally. "But with clear conditions and expectations that protect both of us going forward." I pulled out a notebook and began writing. "First, the public acknowledgement of my role in founding and funding the company must be complete and accurate, not some vague reference to family support. Second, my authority over major business decisions must be real and respected, not just a formality to satisfy legal requirements." Marcus listened intently as I continued outlining my conditions. "Third, I want regular involvement in company operations, including monthly meetings where I'm briefed on financial performance, major contracts, and strategic planning. I'm not interested in day-to-day management, but I want to be an informed partner rather than a silent investor." The fourth condition was the most important. Finally, I want our family relationship to be separate from our business relationship. Personal conflicts cannot be allowed to spill over into professional decisions, and business disagreements cannot be used to justify personal attacks or legal harassment. Marcus agreed to each condition without hesitation, though I could see him calculating the implications of my increased involvement in company operations. For 30 years, he had operated with complete autonomy, making decisions without consultation or oversight. That independence was about to end, replaced by genuine partnership that would require collaboration and transparency. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details of the restructured partnership, with Marcus calling Vincent Torres to join us for the legal review. Vincent arrived with obvious satisfaction at seeing us negotiate a collaborative resolution, rather than proceeding with the nuclear option of partnership dissolution that would have destroyed Harrison and Associates entirely. By afternoon, We had signed agreements that formally acknowledged my role as founding partner and primary investor in what was now Harrison Family Construction. The press release that would announce these changes was scheduled for distribution the following morning, ensuring that the business community would understand the true nature of our relationship. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to me with an expression of genuine gratitude. "Mom, I know I have a lot of work to do to earn back your trust and respect, but I want you to know that I'm committed to becoming the man you raised me to be, not the person I allowed myself to become." After he left, I sat in my quiet living room reflecting on the dramatic changes that had occurred in just 1 month. The woman who had been told to find employment at 75 had revealed herself to be the financial architect of Cedar Falls' most successful construction company. The son who had challenged his mother's competency had been forced to acknowledge his complete dependence on her generosity and wisdom. But more than that, I had discovered aspects of myself that had been dormant for decades. The confidence to assert my rights, the willingness to demand respect, the ability to navigate complex business and legal challenges. These capabilities had always been there, waiting beneath the surface of accommodating motherhood and quiet support. The following week brought a stream of visitors to my Maple Street duplex, people who had suddenly discovered that the modest woman they had barely noticed was actually one of Cedar Falls's most significant business figures. Mayor Hendricks came to discuss my participation in economic development planning. Frank Delacroix stopped by to explore potential collaboration opportunities. Caroline Foster visited to help me establish a more formal investment management structure. Each conversation reinforced the reality that I had stepped permanently out of the shadows, claiming a place in the community's business leadership that reflected my actual contributions rather than my preferred invisibility. The most surprising visitor was Bethany, who arrived one evening with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of genuine contrition. She had clearly been crying, her usual perfect appearance replaced by raw vulnerability. "Dorothy, I've come to apologize," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Not because Marcus told me to, but because I've spent the past week thinking about how I've treated you, and I'm horrified by my own behavior." I invited her in, curious to hear what she had to say. "I built my entire identity around being married to a successful, self-made businessman," Bethany continued. "When I met Marcus, I was attracted to his confidence, his ambition, his apparent ability to create something significant from nothing. I never questioned where his opportunities had come from because it was more convenient to believe in the fairy tale." She sat on the edge of my sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But the truth is, I was embarrassed by you not because of your lifestyle or appearance, but because you represented authenticity and substance that I've never possessed. You built wealth through hard work and sacrifice. You supported your family through genuine love and generosity. You created something meaningful with your life while I've spent mine focused on appearances and social positioning." The apology was more honest and self-aware than I had expected from someone whose previous interactions with me had been characterized by condescension and manipulation. "Bethany, I appreciate your honesty," I replied. "But I need you to understand that respect isn't something that can be turned on and off based on convenience or social pressure. If we're going to have a relationship going forward, it needs to be built on genuine acceptance rather than strategic positioning." She nodded earnestly. "I understand. I want to earn your respect, not just demand it. I want to learn from you, not just tolerate you. I want to be part of a family that values substance over appearance, contribution over consumption." Over the following months, I watched both Marcus and Bethany work to rebuild their relationship with me and with their own values. Marcus involved me meaningfully in company operations, seeking my input on major decisions and publicly acknowledging my contributions at industry events. Bethany began volunteering at the literacy center where I had worked for years, discovering satisfaction in service that her previous social activities had never provided. The changes weren't always smooth or immediate. Decades of ingrained behavior patterns don't disappear overnight, and there were moments when old attitudes resurfaced. But the fundamental shift in our family dynamics was permanent, built on honest acknowledgement of contributions and mutual respect rather than convenient fiction. Harrison Family Construction prospered under our collaborative leadership, with my financial expertise and Marcus's operational management creating a more stable and strategic approach to growth. The company's reputation in the community actually improved when people learned about the family partnership that had always been its foundation. 6 months after the competency hearing, I received an invitation to speak at the Pacific Northwest Women in Business conference about my experience as a silent partner who had found her voice. The audience of female entrepreneurs and investors was fascinated by my story of decades spent supporting others' success while building my own capabilities in the background. During the question and answer session, a young woman asked me what advice I would give to others who found themselves in similar situations, supporting family members' businesses while receiving little recognition for their contributions. Remember that your value doesn't depend on other people's acknowledgement, I replied. Build your own competence, document your own contributions, and never allow anyone to convince you that your support is less valuable than their performance. And if respect isn't offered freely, be prepared to demand it strategically. The applause that followed was gratifying, but not as satisfying as the knowledge that I had finally claimed my rightful place in the story of my own life. As I drove home from the conference that evening, I passed the construction site where Harrison Family Construction was building Cedar Falls' new community center. The sign at the entrance read, Harrison Family Construction, founded 1993 by Dorothy Harrison, and below it, in smaller text, Marcus Harrison, Operations Manager. It was a small change in signage, but it represented a fundamental shift in how our family's success would be remembered and understood. The silent partner had found her voice, and the lesson in genuine independence had been learned by all involved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.